I'm Danny Veira, and I am a millennial, and my dream for the future is that equity and empowerment are king. So everyone has what they need to thrive, and they feel empowered by others to do so.
Hi, I'm Inhe Choi. I am told that I'm a boomer generation because I'm 60 years old. My hope and the vision for the future is that we live in an inclusive and equitable world where all people, without exception, are protected and supported to live to their full potential.
Okay, so Inhe, I'm so glad to have you for this episode of Amplify. Because you and I have gotten to know each other in like the coolest possible way over the past year. And usually there isn't a better Chicago person on these episodes. So I will introduce myself, but it's like people know me. So I'm Danny. I'm the Director of Communications and Engagement at A Better Chicago, where we are a venture philanthropy that focuses on ending poverty in the city by investing in opportunities for low-income Black and Latinx young people from cradle to career. And we do this Amplify series because we want to elevate voices of leaders, BIPOC leaders across the city who are just coming from different viewpoints because they're coming from different generations, right? And how do we work intergenerationally to solve some of like the most complex issues that we're seeing in our communities and in our society? And so I would love for you to introduce yourself because your background is awesome, and just like hearing you talk about yourself makes me so happy.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's a privilege to, be here with you and speak to the A Better Chicago audience and community, and to talk about some of the work or thinking that I've been having. So thank you so much. So I am with the HANA Center. HANA Center is an immigrant justice organization that provides critical services and organize for power of Korean American, Asian American, and multi-ethnic immigrant communities in the Chicago area. So that's the work I do. And personally, I was born and raised in Seoul, Korea, and I immigrated to the US when I was 12 years old with my family. And actually, we immigrated straight to Chicago, and I grew up in Rogers Park. And I went to Chicago public schools, and I even went to college here. So Chicago is, of a home to me in every sense of the way. And I've been doing community work and in the immigrant rights, women's rights, and social and racial justice work all my adult life.
Wow, that's so amazing. And so, like, what inspired you to get into that space?
You know, when you grow up as an immigrant child and with immigrant parents who have language and cultural barriers, you grow up being a translator and being an advocate. And so you grow up with community in your family, relatives, and community of adults, who are very, capable, well-functioning people, but because of their language and cultural barriers, they actually can't function wholly or independently in this U.S. society. So, I grew up learning from early on. We as children, we just learned quicker in the language, and you just learn the system. I mean, this is where you're growing up. So, I learned quickly the power of language and just the knowledge of the American culture and systems. So growing up, like I knew I had to share that and uplift, first generation immigrants like my own parents that I have so much respect for. I really, I was compelled to really uplift them, and in fact, for all immigrants. So that's on a personal level, but I do have couple ways that I think that really influenced me to be in this work that I've been. And one was after college, I was fortunate enough to have held a job with the Harold Washington administration. in the Asian American affairs. And he was the mayor that really opened the iron doors of the fifth floor, as we call it in Chicago, after Mayor Daley, for a long legacy of the machine. And so he opened doors to Asian American affairs, Latinx affairs, or we called it Latino affairs, LGBTQ affairs there was like women's affairs. It was very intersectional, right? So, having, and I actually even met with him. I was a kind of a fresh out of school, and he met with me because I got hired. And mayors don't do that, but he was very accessible. And he said, why don't you go find out what the issues are in the Asian American community, and let's see how city responds. I'm like, so to me, government worked, right?
Yeah.
Government was working for people, and through his that administration, and unfortunately, after he died so suddenly, we were able to achieve the work that we started with him, but finished after his death, was getting affirmative action goals for Asian Americans that we didn't have before. So I learned the power of what government can do, power of legislation, the power of systemic change in that way. And then the other thing, as I was doing that work, I also learned, so much of patriarchy, misogyny, gender-based violence, how there were so many survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. So that led me to actually help found an organization called Kenwin that works with survivors who weren't getting support because of, again, language and cultural barriers. So those are some of the ways that really impacted me as I was really becoming and learning the ways in the working world, adult world, to be in this path.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen a lot of things change over time here in Chicago, like not even just like mayoral, but like you've seen change in CPS, you've seen change in neighborhoods and communities. Like, tell me a little bit about what that's been like for you.
I mean, that change, yeah, that's a long span of time to see the change, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that one big change, I mean, especially at my age and just having grown up in Chicago, I mean, manufacturing jobs are gone, right? Union jobs are gone. I mean, in fact, I think about my high school peers, like some of them didn't go to, college because they were able to get jobs, or they were Chicago was a lot like working class, especially in Rogers Park. I grew up with all of that, right? I mean, I could say things like, Earth was healthier, right? There were less guns. And I think also there was so much less wealth gaps, right? Between like the lowest wage earning people to the company's highest, earning folks. I think those gaps are so much older. We didn't have things like selective enrollment schools. There's a lot of changes where it's so much harder to navigate through different systems. I mean, and we didn't have this many Black people who's incarcerated. A lot of changes. So, that's just too many to list. But I do know that there are some. It's harder. It's harder, especially for younger generation. With all of that. And the higher education was a lot more accessible. We didn't have to deal with the kind of debt that people are dealing with.
I mean, it's kind of crazy because like as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about like in my brain the things that like felt like major changes for like a millennial, right? Where like Obama was elected. Like there were like these moments that like 9/11 happened when I was in high school.
Right.
Like all of those things that like felt really like important. And now seeing kind of like the shift towards like what Black Lives Matter looks like now to what it was when Trayvon happened, right? And like all of that feels like it's been decades, but it really only happened in the span of like maybe 8 years, right? And so how you like, I just find it so interesting to think about the amount of years that you've seen change happen in Chicago and in our country, and then like the vast amount of change that's happened in just like the past 5 years when it comes to like diversity, equity, inclusion, even having that term be a term that people talk about.
That's right. That's right. Or BIPOC,
right?
like that's
Exactly.
new, right? Yeah.
And there are a lot of feelings about that term, but like, it's like even the attempt to try to create inclusive terms and
Even among
terminology.
people of color.
Yeah.
It's even among, like, we didn't talk about so much about indigenous people, but now we
Yeah.
are more, right? And, or Asian Americans. And there's so many Asian American organizations now that, because of our immigration history, especially in
Mhm.
Chicago area, where it was so much about settlement and about it, critical initial social services that people need. But now folks are talking more about systemic change and really including
Yeah.
things like racial justice into the framework and intentionality. And those are big changes too.
I know. Yeah, it's exciting, and it's also like, what can we hope for quickly? Like, what can we hope for quickly, and what's going to be like, we have to completely break down the system and rebuild
Mm-hmm,
it.
mm-hmm,
And so I think what's interesting is that, like, there are some misconceptions, right? Some stereotypes about boomers and like how they get involved in this kind of work. And that's why I think it's kind of awesome that like we can have this conversation, because you are very much in the forefront of these efforts. And so like, tell me a little bit about what that's like to be, 16, like killing it in this world.
Well, I mean, you mean like, I mean, I just feel like in terms of like staying on, staying in this work. But I think in terms of the work, with so many younger people coming on, I think paying attention to the different generation, I think it's not always easy to understand, right? And like, I think a lot of people, if you're not in the work, people may not know what BIPOC is. There's a lot of language changes, right? So I mean, even like Black Lives Matter, people say, but now it's movement for Black lives, right? So I think that
Hmm.
slowly people are catching on Black lives. Oh my God, it's changing. So there's a lot of things that are changing all the time. And actually, I believe that the education and analysis gets sharper and sharper. And I think people are doing a lot more intersectional, because even when I was younger, the work around racial justice was very much about like race, right?
Hmm.
I've been in conversations with even prominent people where they say, we're only talking about race. We're not talking about gender. We're not talking about
Yeah.
class, let alone like
Hmm.
immigration status. It was very much like linear, right? But I think younger generations are really bringing in the intersectional analysis more and pushing it and much more direct
Yeah.
about it, which I think is really awesome. But I think as an older person, well, becoming older, I was once younger, I think paying attention to young people, listening, and really giving ways and making space for young people to lead and be open to learning about it, learning from young people, no matter how sometimes it sounds a little weird and like, what are you talking about? And you're talking about everything, but I think it's really important for older people, and it's not always easy, as I said, but I think it's also, we also have to let go. What we know, what our ways is, it's going to be evolving. I think when you're doing community work, and if you call yourself organizers, these are just organic. It's constant change by nature, and we have to actually embrace that. But it gets harder as you get older, right? So I think we have to be really intentional and really practicing like letting go, taking something new, and also sharing that power, sharing that knowledge. So like, just including folks like, in my position, I try to do my best. I'm sure I don't do it well. I fail most of the time, but really the intention is to try to share the decision-making power, share the discussion, share it from the early on, right? And then really, connecting young people with the people that and the people with the resources and different, I think that's our job, is to really consistently try to do that. So it's kind of like, as a parent, like I read a book once long time ago as a parent with younger kids, like how to talk to them so they will listen, and then how to
Hmm.
listen so they will talk. I think that's a really good thing that I try to remember a lot, right? And then I think as an older person, if I may ask, I think as a younger person, which I think about this, like just recognizing that there's a history, there's experience and wisdom that, and ask questions for support. I think that's also that is important. but I'd rather not speak for the young people. Maybe you could share what you think is like ways that as we see change, how do we still, how do we work together?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. And it's funny because like I also have moments where I'm like, I guess I'm not that young anymore too. Like where
Every
like my,
day.
you know what I mean? Like it's like, I mean, like I guess I'm a millennial, but like there is a whole new generation that is like very much in tune with like trans lives and like environmental like impact and sustainability and like conversations that like you're right are so intersectional, like are so intersectional, and like those things were not happening for me even in like my world of advocacy for the past like 15 years. And so it's actually pretty cool to think about like how, as like I'm the generation of the internet, right, but they're the generation of globalization and social media, which is like, good God, what is that? And so we're all generations of new tools and like innovations, and there's a learning there where it's just like the world is getting smaller and smaller the further we go into this work, and just like as the internet continues to evolve. And so it's just interesting to think about like taking some of that energy that I think a lot of young people bring to this work and channeling it without losing the like you said, the history, because I do think it starts to become, even politically, it starts to become like, oh, these old dinosaurs that we need to like retire, where like sometimes there's, there's knowledge there that we do want to keep. Like there is a reason why, public service is public service and not like a career. Like you don't choose to go into policy just to make money for the next 40 years. Usually it is a service that you are doing to your community, and it's not like your long-term goal. And so thinking about that, like I always grew up with that mentality, and I find it so interesting that like now the commentary is around like, how do I turn like my career into being a politician? Like how do I become a career politician? Which is just like, that boggles the mind, but it's a whole different conversation. But you know what I mean? And so it's interesting to think about like, I think that's the whole point of us wanting to do these conversations, is like having those intergenerational talks about like what is working, where can we be collaborating more, where can we be thinking about like the lessons that have already been learned, the like ground that has already been covered. And something that like I loved that you and I talked about, it feels like it was yesterday, but it was like a year ago, the last time we were in person at Platform Impact. And when we were talking about like the 1619 project, and then like both of us were kind of like just trying to understand different ways to talk to our communities around the intersectionality between like making sure Black people understand what's going on for Asian Americans in that fight, and then making sure Asian Americans understand what's happening with movement for Black lives. And it just kind of crazy culminated into what's happening right now in the world. So I just love to talk about that a little bit more.
And I think, speaking also in an intergenerational way, at the height of, after George Floyd's murder and all the racial justice uprising, the, movement for Black Lives uprising, we actually got a call at the HANA Center from what we call second generation immigrants, the younger generation immigrants that said, I know that you all lead with racial justice and social justice, framework in all the work that we do. Um, because when we say immigrant justice, it's an intersectional analysis around what we mean by that, right? So they asked if we can support them, um, to communicate with their parents who they felt were so anti-Black. And then because they were, very much emotionally, upset and like really trying to figure out what to do. So, we as an organization, I myself as an older person, I really felt like this is such a deep issue. This is like, so we have to really take on a meaningful approach. So how do we do that in a way that people can really take in, internalize, and commit to a struggle that probably will be forever, right? It doesn't just go away. And
Mhm.
so we ended up, you know, launching this effort, what we're calling listening sessions with different people, but like really dividing up first generation immigrants and the younger generation immigrants. Because the first generation, the way they're approaching their orientation to racial justice is really different from the second generation, because they come, oh, sorry, they come from, you know, homogenous societies, and, you know, and so race is not really something that they dealt with at all, right? And they come here maybe having, you know, escaped war, you know, extreme, you know, poverty, you know, the political persecutions. It's like a different level where being here, surviving, it's a huge success. Like they've already won the American dream in a way, just by mere fact that they're living. And and then they come here knowing that there could be discrimination. Like they just expect that they could just put up with it, right? Where second generation were born and raised here, you're other, you are not, you know, you're a minority, and there's something different or wrong with you, even, right? And you deserve discrimination, kind of a way. So we approach it so differently. So we started to hold this listening sessions with like the moms group, business groups, you know, professionals or faith leaders, as a way to hear from them where they're at, as a way for us to then develop a program, education program, a discussion program for them to, you know, so we're like trying to meet where they're at without judging them.
Yeah.
Because not everyone has the opportunity to even talk about racial justice in an immigrant life when they work at nail salon, they, you know, 11, you know, and like 12, 14 hours a day. They don't necessarily talk about this stuff. They're just like busy trying to survive, right? And they come ready to sacrifice for their children. I think those are the
Mhm.
some ways that we're dealing with this sort of like pandemic. And pandemic is actually supporting in a way, because like we're able to do Zoom calls. We meet at 8 o'clock, end at 10 o'clock at night, you know, some of this kind of ways. But it's bringing us to have this conversation, at least to start where they're at, with a vision of, you know, trying to figure this out better.
Yeah, I love that. And I feel like there has been a lot of like, okay, how do we band together as communities against white supremacy versus being, you know, like in this crabs in a barrel kind of terminology where it's like us versus them and each group is just trying to like get by, right? Like we are all dealing with different prejudices and different issues. And so it's just I've found that I've had such beautiful conversations, particularly with people in social impact work, right? Like it's different. Like you said, even knowing the terminology BIPOC, that is natural to you. It is
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
always like
Right.
what people are bringing to the conversation, right? And so meeting people where they are is so important because we're all kind of specialists in very different ways of our lives. And like, I remember you taught me so much about just like how you were explaining like the Black experience in America to like first generation Korean immigrants. And I thought that was like it was, I still use it. It's like just like the most straightforward 101 description. And I would like for you to like just do that for our listeners because I felt like that was so impactful for me.
I think you were talking about how when we were doing these types of racial justice training, because the context is so different, you know, there's one way to understand, yes, like, you know, Black people, like the history, how, you know, the slavery, the white supremacy, all the criminal justice system. You could talk about that, they intellectually understand without really like, you have to internalize it. You have to believe in it. You have to, as I said, commit to the vision, commit to like, I'm going to struggle forever. You have to internalize it. And then I could tell, like, we were just talking about, you know, it's like reading a book and you know what the answer is, kind of a thing, and that's just not going to do it. So, you know, we ended up turning this into a context that they could understand, which was under the Japanese colonialism that the first generation Koreans were living under, where, you know, we were lynched, we were like, you know, dismembered, we We were the dirty race. We were all this like horrible ways. When we switched the context and the exercises into the Japanese colonial days, they totally got it. You know, where like the white people would be, that the white supremacy would be the Japanese, you know, imperialists, right? And
Mhm.
then like all the different races. And so they were so getting it. And
No, but I do think that that is like reframe, being able to reframe things in a
yeah,
context that
right,
actually like creates empathy is invaluable, like
right.
that ability. And it is very hard for people to do that. And I didn't even know that history also. Like, I mean, like we always talk about how you have to read more than what you're taught in school, because like I'm sure at some point in some world history lesson I did learn that and I just forgot.
Mhm.
But like you
No, I
explaining it,
believe me, you did not learn that.
right?
American history, we don't talk about what's happening around the other countries, let alone what US is doing. You know, US is foreign policy, it's trade policy, so what the corporations are doing to other countries, and the military policies are really creating all these like displacements, you know,
Mhm.
immigration, migration. People are coming here because it's, why would you leave your home? People immigrate here because you can't survive there for different reasons,
Mhm.
right? And so, you know, US has a lot to do with causing these immigration, these causing these, you know, undocumented immigration. And yet it made it sound like it's somebody else's problem that the US has to deal with. So I think we really have to remember that connection. So globalization isn't just about like, you know, we could get our genes being made by another country thing. Globalization already happened in terms of imperialism and colonialism, and it's just a different context, and we have to remember that the US does not teach that. So we have to also revamp the education system.
I 100% agree. And like, I kind of loved that that you and I having that exchange around like how you were reframing this happened because we were talking about the 1619 project, which like does try to kind of like dig deeper
Mhm,
into US history and like reteach how we think about the oppressive and systemically racist systems that exist in our country and how we reimagine them. And so, like, I get really hopeful when people have conversations like this where it's like, there is no end to the way we can reimagine rebuilding, especially post pandemic, right? Like, we are still smack dab in the middle of a pandemic. I think people are trying to think that like we are in the post COVID world already, but we're not
mhm,
there.
mhm,
And so like there's some hope there around
mhm,
like
mhm,
how we recognizing like all the things that COVID has like exacerbated, all those
mhm,
inequities, like how do we then work on solving them and
mhm,
rebuilding them and
yeah,
reimagining them in the recovery. And I just get really excited when I get to talk to people like you about this, because I feel like we're both, our organizations are attacking it from different angles, right? But like we're still attacking very systemic issues and finding opportunities for the next generation to be able to like really create a world where there's equity.
mhm, mhm. I mean, I think that, you know, in this moment, there are some, you know, really, it's really hard, right? Black people are still getting killed by the police and others. We are also seeing rising in anti-Asian hate. I know that's something like kind of a newer to the American public, you know, but it's also important to remember that there had been legislation by this country even from before the turn of the century, you know, like there are laws that made like Asian women to be sort of like disease holders. We're like sexual beings, and disease holders was how it all really, Page Act started like that. There were Chinese exclusion acts. There were like, you know, Japanese who were interned in a concentration camp because they were association with the Japanese government in Japan, which they're not. They're US citizens, right? They're just like, you know, Asians were, you know, lynched. Asians were in a human zoo. Like there's so many things like that had already been here. And, you know, so, and also like, you know, I don't know if you know, but like about a month ago, you know, it was all over the Stop Asian Hate, that whole, the database that were collecting stories of attacks, from verbal to physical attacks. There
Mhm.
were 3,800 reported cases. Within last month, it almost doubled. just in 1 month. So it's really increasing, right? And then we saw from like individualized, cases to like mass killing, like Atlanta shooting, right? And so, and those are like where the intersectional pieces come in, where it's about race and gender and class, right? And how, again, it's also about foreign policy, because Asian women have been so festicized and sexualized, and it actually started with like the US military bases that have been proliferated in Asia, and how we're just like viewed, we're like the people, it's like proliferating the sex industry that's carrying over here, where women are being raped and trafficked, and and these people that are targeting us is really going without, and many of them are white, right? Without any accountability, right? So when we even look at these cases of anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian racism, we also see a lot of, Black faces, right? But then it's reported that like about 70% are white people, but we don't hear that. We do hear a lot more when they're Black people. But then we also don't realize it's happening in areas where they're homeless people, right? They're not well people. These are people who are on the streets, not well. And when you look at in Chicago, about 80% of the homeless people are Black people. So what's encouraging is that we as Asian people who are dealing with these things are really still, calling out police. More police is not the answer. We need more sustainable policy and programs that support people like who are homeless, you know, and to really kind of look at like what needs to be happening and what needs not to be happening. And even to say, like this whole like hate crime, this is all anti-Asian hate. Like when you say it's hate crime, then it's like you get into the legal arguments. Is it really hate? Like it's on the burden of the proof is on the survivor, which is so ridiculous. And then you get into this whole other thing. And if you just keep having reports on hate crime, what does the government do? Oh, we need more cops. Right. So it's very counterproductive. And we as a society right now, we're so used to just being like, that's where your mind goes, right? Like you said, we have to reimagine, we have to re-educate ourselves that certain things that you think of the answer, that's actually not. This whole system is set out to hurt us, never to really support us. So we have to reimagine, re-educate ourselves to think about it in a different way and demand, like defunding police is all about taking that funding and put it in the social programs, taking in a way that's really long term. And I do believe that all this is being led, I do believe that, by young people. It's the Black Lives Matter young people who, Movement for Black Lives have really led this, right? Defunding police and reinvesting in Black communities, reinvesting in the communities, right? Our young people at the HANA Center are totally embracing this. They're now total part of and leader in the Cops Out of CPS, that led to college students that calling for cops out of their college campuses. And we also work with undocumented people, undocumented. It's not, the immigration is, Asian Americans are also very much part of the immigration work. And, 1 out of 6 Korean Americans are undocumented. So there's a lot of it. There's Black folks who are undocumented. We work with Undocumented Black, which is a group that is made up of immigrants from Caribbean and African countries who are undocumented. So we work together. So there's a lot to be learned, and we're all working together, and especially about calling how we cannot be criminalizing immigrants. Criminalization really has to end. And so, it's really in calling like abolishment of ICE, and to also connecting that to defunding ICE. These connections that people are making are all led by young people. So we're very, encouraged by that. And one last thing I just want to say that, at the height of the whole like June George Floyd, there was a call from the Movement for Black Lives leaders to come and listen to us. So we organized a call with them and the Asian community. And because, again, this is like a pandemic specific, we had a Zoom call. And you know how many people joined? 7,500 Asian Americans joined.
What?
They want to hear from, these leaders of the Movement for Black Lives. And it was beautiful. And it was really amazing. And not only because of their analysis and what they were saying, but there was so much love for each other and for the community that I have to say, it was really inspiring. And I think that really led a lot of our young people to really do more coalescing and working together toward a
love
real systemic racial justice.
I love that. And I kind of just want to end on this because I do think like the intersectionality is like the beauty of it all, right? Like we are seeing we're unlocking so many of those like overlapping issues that are creating spaces where our young people can't thrive, right? Like we know that like you can't just have a kid go to school. You have to make sure that kid has a great home life and food in their stomach and like is supported socially and emotionally and has like then that teachers have trauma informed education plans and like all of that. And I get very hopeful when I think about the way that like conversations like what you just described are happening and the way that we're all kind of like coming together to think about particularly the Black community and the Asian American community, right? Like, which have often been at odds, like to find ways to uplift all of us, right? And I just love that kind of connectedness. And I think Chicago is such an interesting microcosm of that in so many ways. So I'm gonna end us with like just one thing, one action that you want to inspire listeners or our viewers to do to kind of help build a better society moving forward.
Can I ask for two?
You can.
So one is really, I mean, as a, we're working right now as immigrants, citizenship, legalization for all 11 million undocumented immigrants. So I ask all the listeners to this that please call the legislator, whether you're in Chicago, Senator Durbin, Duckworth, and all your legislators, but other states that, please call your legislator to say, please include immigrants in the budget reconciliation process. I know it's a little bit, techie, like specific, but that's what you say, because it's like, that's a place where we could do, get that done. I think the other broader, more thematic ask that I would ask is that, as we think about, as I said, I think the young people are really leading this, and I think we have to pay attention as an older person, but we have to pay attention and have the vision for, seeing we all have to work together, right? So I would say, I think everyone should connect with someone who inspired you to do the work that you are doing and tell them how much you appreciate them. So specific ask is if you're an older person, call somebody younger, somebody from the younger generation. And then if you're a younger generation, maybe you want to think about older generation person who is inspiring you and connect. I think it's all about connection. It's about relationship. And it's about that love that's going to carry our work forward.
I love that. Thank you so much, Inhe. I'm so glad that we were able to have this conversation, and thank you for joining for our Amplify series.
Thank you so much for having me here.